Hello, everyone. I'm going to try and do this occasionally because I know there are some things that are pretty complicated, and a lot of you took the class for certain ideas and concepts and investigations. So we're going to get into Chapter 8, which is death investigations, which is kind of ironic given the circumstances that we're in today. But we're going to talk about death investigations, meaning when somebody dies out there in the world, law enforcement shows up. And when law enforcement shows up, they have to determine, what caused this person to die. I mean, that's the nature of all investigative work that we do, and this is pretty important stuff. So I'm going to try and explain it to you, what the coroner does, what the detective does. Hopefully my two pupils here, Odie and Finn, will understand death investigations by the end of this. But what I want you to understand is when someone calls up and it's a result of someone dying, generally you're not going to be prepared for that. You're going to have a lot of people there pretty upset, pretty scared. And when you get there, you have to act quickly. First assuming, remember at the beginning of the course when we talked about inductive reasoning, look at what you've got. Don't jump to any kind of conclusion, but try and get an idea of how this person died, because that determines what your next actions are going to be. What I want you to understand is when you roll up on an investigation of a dead body, people die, and we classify the death in one of four ways. The first way is natural, which is what we're faced with today. Law enforcement are going to be going on many calls where someone has died, and we have to determine whether it's natural. Keep in mind, I know a lot of you have watched a lot of TV shows. Again, we're always going to be thinking of, okay, it looks like it's natural. Maybe they got coronavirus, maybe they died. You always have to assume that it could be something else. But in most cases, if you roll up on somebody and you're called to someone that's senior, 80s, 85, they have some precondition, they've got cancer, they've got something. Things that we're going to be talking about later in another lecture, which is, are they under the consultation of a doctor? Do we have things that show this person was struggling to be here? So anyway, natural, pretty obvious. Someone dies because of natural causes. The second one's accidental. Accidental can be very confusing depending on whether or not we're going to prosecute, and we'll come to that in another lecture. Because clearly there are times in life, many in Utah here, where somebody uses a firearm and didn't intend to kill somebody, but they did. So when we look at it, was it accidental or was it something else? Right now, all I want you to be thinking about, accidental are those ones that are clearly the person died as a result mainly of their own doing. Someone's climbing up a ladder, someone's on a roof, they fall off a roof. Somebody's skateboarding and they hit their skull on the concrete, something that person did to themselves. It's pretty obvious. That's accidental. The third one, and we'll come back to this later, is suicide. Clearly, this is one of the ones that caught me off guard when I first started policing, because the numbers that we deal with. Suicide, again, could certainly be manipulated, like we saw in videos at the beginning of the course. When we talked about Kurt Cobain, could it have been manipulated? Certainly. But when you're looking at things, there are times when it's pretty obvious based on family, talking to family, this is clearly a suicide. And we'll talk about all those indicators of things that we expect to see if it is in fact a suicide. Remember, back to square one. When we start to do inductive reasoning, it's all about, in the thousands of times that I've been on a call and it was suicide, is this what I see? Is this the same thing? I know, Odie, are you paying attention? You gotta pay attention or you're not gonna understand suicide. So anyway, and then the fourth one, and the most complicated, is homicide. And when we look at homicide, I want you to understand, the definition of homicide is the killing of a human being by another human being. Don't always think that it's criminal. Certainly when we talk about criminal homicide, we'll get into that. But there are certainly times that we call it justifiable homicide, when somebody can take the life of another individual. Clearly when it's during wartime, the military. Clearly when law enforcement has to take someone's life to protect. You yourself, when you're trying to protect yourself, self-defense. Absolutely. It's homicide. The person's death was caused by a human, but it was not criminal. I want you to understand when we talk about criminal homicide, there are two classes of criminal homicides, two classes: murder and manslaughter. I'm not going to go into great detail about this. Many of you will go on to criminal law and will break it down better in that particular class. But right now, understand there are two types of criminal homicide: murder and manslaughter. Let's talk about murder. Definition of murder is the killing of a human being with malice aforethought. And keep in mind, malice aforethought, these are legal jargon terms that we use. It means that you wanted this person to die. Malice means I want them to die. It isn't until we start looking at when did you start thinking about this where we have the degrees. So when we talk about first degree murder, it's all about premeditated. You thought about it beforehand, you planned it, and you went out and did it. So malice is not premeditation. Premeditation was you planned it. If you planned it, and then of course you wanted it to happen. The thing that's important here is, as a detective, we don't have to worry about motive at this point. That's something the prosecution will do. All we're going to do at this point is we want to determine how did they die, one of the four ways, and is it criminal or non-criminal homicide. If it's criminal and it is murder, was it thought about? And then you have to prove your case. And we'll get into all the things that we're going to do at that point. When we talk about second degree murder, this is obviously when there is no premeditation involved. Certainly someone killed somebody. Their intent was there. A lot of these we call crimes of passion. Someone walks in on their significant other that's having a relationship with somebody else. It wasn't premeditated, but they took the life of that individual. These are generally what we call second degree murder. Third degree murder, very complicated because it gets very close to what we're going to be talking about next, which is manslaughter. I'm not going to get into that one. I'll let you do that later for a class that's in depth. But let's talk about manslaughter. And keep in mind, I didn't make up these terms. Certainly manslaughter seems much worse when you hear it than murder. It's not. For whatever reason, murder is worse. Manslaughter is a lesser degree of punishment that we attach to it. So definition of manslaughter is the unlawful killing of another person with malice, but without premeditation. And remember, where we get to manslaughter, it's because we have voluntary or involuntary. So you'll hear these terms many times: involuntary manslaughter or voluntary manslaughter. When we talk about voluntary manslaughter, this again is very close to the heat of passion. You didn't want to kill this person, and that's why it's up to the prosecution to decide. Do I go second degree murder or do I go voluntary manslaughter? Very close in the elements of the crime. But for the most part, when we talk about voluntary manslaughter, at that moment in that person's life, they wanted that person to die. They didn't think about it prior to that. They didn't plan it, but something occurred. The anger inside of them, it occurred, and their life, the life was taken. This is where we talk about voluntary. Involuntary manslaughter, on the other hand, are those cases where someone did take the life of another individual, but they didn't want to take the life. These are things like DUIs. Clearly the person went to the bar, they were drinking. They didn't intend to kill anybody, but as a result of what they did. This is that category. Involuntary manslaughter is where I say the average person looking at the scenario would say, well, no shit. Of course what you did caused somebody to die. Drinking. You drank a lot at the bar. Of course you're going to kill. You're texting on the phone. Of course you're going to kill somebody if you're not paying attention. There's many of these. Kids that are left in hot cars. Children that are left unattended in a bathtub or in a pool. It's like, no shit. You caused this person to die because you're ignorant. And this is where we get into that involuntary manslaughter. So these are what we call the criminal homicides. Remember, suicide is a very unique circumstance. Someone takes their own life. Clearly, this is technically criminal because we don't want that to happen. Are we going to prosecute? Well, no, of course not. But you have a lot of people that are involved that want to have an answer. They don't want to accept that this was a suicide because of a lot of reasons. They just don't want to accept it. I had a particular story where a good friend of mine, a police officer, to this day, it still doesn't feel good inside because his daughter, we found his daughter and the boyfriend dead in a bed, and there was clearly some wine there on the nightstand, and clearly a lot of pills that were next to the wine and the nightstand. The officer involved clearly wanted to think that the boyfriend did this without his daughter knowing. We're never going to know this. Clearly this was a murder-suicide. Somebody had to administer it, but it could have been something that they worked out, and it was a double suicide. There are times that we just don't know. Again, there's 4 ways that people die. It's not the detective's job to determine that death and how they die. We will come to an assumption in the investigation, but the coroner's job is twofold. Number 1, they will determine which one of those 4 and how the person died. And number 2, this is extremely important, we'll come back to it later, is TOD, the time of death. Coroner is doing 2 things. 1, saying how the person died, and I want to know the time of the death. There are many times when the coroner and the detectives, we just don't know. And we'll close out the investigation not really knowing sometimes. But if we just don't know in the investigation initially, because there's not enough information, or I'm just not feeling good that I believe this is a suicide, that I believe this is natural, if there's things there that give me that feeling that something's not right, we call this an equivocal death. Have to make sure I don't write it wrong. Equivocal. An equivocal death is nothing more than it's suspicious. I'm not going to jump to conclusions at this point because something about this just doesn't feel right. I had one where I had to go to a concrete plant where there was a lot of people around pretty upset. When I get there, I see an individual on the ground, clearly dead. The head is pretty much gone. Torso's there. And it took a while to figure out what happened. There were 2 people that were involved cutting this big concrete tube. One individual was down below when this tube became, when the guy on the ladder started cutting through. When he cut through the iron, this concrete drainage pipe rolled, and when the 2 pipes rolled together, it rolled together at about 6 foot. This individual was about 6'3". Without him realizing what was happening, these 2 concrete pillars came together, crushing his skull. And you can imagine when we're there, we're trying to put this together. How could this be? It's clearly not natural. It clearly is not a suicide. You know, is there something here that was at play that was, no shit, you shouldn't have done this, this was dangerous, and should it be a manslaughter, or was it just an accident? In this particular case, we ruled it later on as, it was definitely equivocal at this point, but we did rule it as an accidental death. We didn't have anything other than to go with accidental. So you can see there's many times we just don't know which way to go. We slow down, and then we accept the coroner's report, and we'll get to that later, and look at details of what's happening before we jump to any conclusion. So anyway, I wanted to get that out to you so at least you understand that is the starting point for any death investigation. You're going to be going on a lot of these. People die. Shocker. And you're going to be that person that has to be there. You're going to be, as the detective, that person that is going to take custody of that body until you deem it appropriate to let a mortuary have the body and the family can arrange for burial. In many cases, if it's natural, we'll do that. If we don't know, the body will go to the coroner's office, and it's tough for everybody, and I get it. It was tough to deal with in my career. You're there with a lot of people that have a lot of questions, but relax. Very few people are actually a victim of homicide, as much as we see it in the news. It's the most that we see in the news, but it's the least likely thing that you're going to come into contact with. Most things that you roll on are accidental, and sadly, a lot of suicides. Many, many suicides. But at this point, we'll leave it at there. Keep in mind that if you have any questions, contact me, send me an email. And when we get to other stuff, I'm going to be putting stuff online that I want you to watch, videos that I want you to understand. And if I feel that maybe you're not getting it based on comments that I'm receiving through email, we'll do another one of these. But stay safe out there, try and avoid contact, and get a hold of me if you have any questions. Thanks.